I recently found out by looking at Facebook memories that 10 years ago I had produced a video specifically about important movements and thinkers within 19th century philosophy. And I'd done so at the request of one of my subscribers, actually somebody who I'd engaged with quite a bit, who said, hey, I'm interested in this. Do you think you could provide an overview? And then when I looked at the comments on the Facebook post from 10 years ago, I saw that other people had said, this is a great idea. You should do this for other periods, movements, that sort of thing. And I thought, yeah, that's a great idea. And then, of course, promptly forgot about it until I was reminded about it. So that's what I'm doing here, and I figured that I could do an entire sequence going through things, not just ancient philosophy, but this period and then that period, talking about who you shouldn't, as we say, sleep on in medieval philosophy. But I wanted to start with something that I've done a lot of work on. I've shot a lot of videos on. I teach pretty routinely, and I've been interested in since my teenage years, and that is a very loose movement that we often call existentialist or existential philosophy, which doesn't include just philosophy. There's also literature, there's theology, there's psychology, there's art, there's all sorts of interconnections, film, right? I'm going to focus mostly just on philosophy and literature, in part to keep this from getting super, super long, but also because I don't know as much about existential psychology, let alone existentialist art, as I do the philosophy and literature that I pretty routinely teach about. And there's going to be some theological stuff in here because there's, some overlap between them. The very first figure that we call an existentialist, Søren Kierkegaard, was, of course, a religious writer who was very influential on theologians. So there's going to be some straying into that. So with no further ado, let's talk about existentialism as a movement. So the first thing that I got to tell you, and this is really critically important, is if you go online and you're like, what is existentialism? You are probably going to get a wrong answer. And the reason you're going to get a wrong answer is not because it's totally wrong, but because you're going to get takes from people who are looking at a portion of existentialist philosophy, and they're taking that as the paradigm for it. And it doesn't help that we've got this guy, Jean-Paul Sartre, who we're going to talk about later on as part of the third wave of existentialism, who is trying to take over the field, so to speak, by defining it as, the philosophy for which existence precedes essence, and there's a lot that has to be explained about that. There were many other existentialists at the time who said, well, if that's what you mean by it, I guess I won't call myself an existentialist anymore. So we're not taking a single formula like that. And I would advise you not to do that, because existentialism is a broad and complicated historical movement that you could say runs for, in its heyday, over a century, and there's many different thinkers within it. There's also some who will deny being existentialist, but when we figure out what they mean by existentialist and what other people mean by it, we can see that they, even though denying it, fit within the existentialist, whatever we want to call it, movement, spectrum, thematic, or something like that. And I'm talking, specifically about Albert Camus in that case. So it's a complex, historically developing movement. There is no actual consensus. Anybody who tells you that there is about exactly who fits into it and who doesn't, they're lying to you, or they're misled, or they're misleading themselves. So, what we can do is say there's some important thinkers that figure into this. There is no definition of existentialism. There's just a bunch of important ideas, themes, ways of doing philosophy that you're going to see connections between these people, and they often tended to inspire each other. So, for example, we will see that there's a lot of existentialists who engage with Fyodor Dostoevsky or Franz Kafka or Rainer Maria Rilke. All of these are literary figures who are also philosophical. We're going to see that later existentialist authors will engage with earlier ones, draw connections between them. So that's important. And it's also important to be careful not to label people as existentialists who didn't think of themselves in that way, but maybe have a lot in common with some of the key themes of existentialist philosophy. For example, philosophy being something that is lived, concrete. Philosophy is a way of life. Some people want to say that Socrates was an existentialist, or Blaise Pascal, or Marcus Aurelius, or other figures, St. Augustine of Hippo, certain characters in Shakespeare's plays. And it's better to call them proto-existentialists, meaning they're not part of a movement, they're not working within exactly the same thematic, but they're doing something kind of like that. Just like when we're talking about music, there's a band that we can say is definitely heavy metal, like Black Sabbath or Deep Purple. And then there are other bands before them where it's kind of some of the stuff is going on, but it's not yet heavy metal, like, say, Jimi Hendrix or Blue Cheer, right? So we have a very much closer in time, though. We have a similar kind of dynamic going on there. So who are the existentialists? Who should you be checking out if you're interested in existentialist philosophy, which I hope you are? So we often talk about the three big 19th century existentialist figures, but there's more going on than just these three. Søren Kierkegaard in Denmark, Fyodor Dostoevsky in Russia, and then Friedrich Nietzsche in Germany, also writing in Switzerland, and traveling in other places as well from time to time. So those are all really important thinkers. Søren Kierkegaard, absolutely central. Fyodor Dostoevsky, also absolutely central. A literary figure, but he's also somebody who incorporates a lot of philosophy into his works. He has his characters argue about it, try to live philosophy out, think through it. And then we have Friedrich Nietzsche as well. And, you might say, well, maybe there's some other people who should be thrown in there, like, Arthur Schopenhauer or Max Stirner. Well, yes and no. I mean, maybe they bear some similarities. Stirner these days, a lot of people are willing to classify him as an existentialist. Schopenhauer, not quite so much. But there are a few other figures in the 19th century who you probably do want to look at and consider. And who are they? Well, one of these is a literary critic who saw the connections between the work of somebody like Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. And his name is Georg Brandes. He, by the way, wrote to Friedrich Nietzsche and suggested that he read Dostoevsky, which Nietzsche did, reading The Demons or the Possessed and saying, wow, this guy's a great psychologist, and that Nietzsche should read Kierkegaard, which Nietzsche didn't do. So already in the 19th century, there's people that are seeing these connections. We have a couple other Russian authors whose works are arguably within the existentialist spectrum in this first wave of existentialism. We could think of Anton Chekhov, and even more before him, Leo Tolstoy, at least certain of his works. And we often see, for example, the short story The Death of Ivan Ilyich incorporated into anthologies on existentialism. So, we've got something where these authors are not directly connected to each other except in kind of tenuous ways, sometimes may have encountered each other's works, but are dealing with similar types of themes. Some people want to say that Henrik Ibsen should figure in there as well. And so we see that existentialism, in its first wave, is something that is, you could say, Central European or Russian. It's in those areas that it is really taking off. So, key figures again, Søren Kierkegaard, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Friedrich Nietzsche. If you can get your hands on his works, Georg Brandes, some of Tolstoy, some of Chekhov, maybe Henrik Ibsen, maybe a few other people as well. And it's really important to point out, existentialism is not a movement where you belong to existentialism. You can't belong to any other movement at all. No, it's connected up with other thinkers, other literary and philosophical movements of the time, and it's also greatly in reaction to things, in reaction to positivism and utilitarianism, and to some degree Hegelianism, and other things, other isms that they're not so keen about, right? So all of this is a great way of thinking about the very first beginnings of existentialism before it's even identified as a movement. Then we can talk about another great important period. And if we want to arbitrarily date it, let's begin it at 1900, although one of the key people involved in it, Lev Shestov, is already writing about the interconnections he sees between Friedrich Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, and Friedrich Nietzsche and Leo Tolstoy before the turn of the century. So let's call this the second wave of existentialist literature, philosophy, theology, if you like, as well. And who are we including in that? So I've already mentioned one name, Lev Shestov, great Russian writer who writes part of his time in Russia and then after the revolution is going to move to Paris, where many other immigrants are going as well. Paris is going to become a hotbed for this down the line. Shestov writes a lot of sort of studies, but also important works of his own in the very early part of the 1900s. Who else figures in with this? We should talk about another Russian, Nikolai Berdyaev, who writes about Dostoevsky and about love and human freedom and stuff like that. Also winds up emigrating to Paris as well. And then we have two important Spanish authors, Miguel de Unamuno, who is probably best known for his work Tragic Sense of Life, in which he's talking about many of these proto-existentialists, articulating existentialist themes, and talking about Kierkegaard. So he's a really key figure, and not that much later, we also have Ortega y Gasset, who is arguably an existentialist figure as well. Studies, phenomenology and existentialism, a lot of overlap between those two movements as well. We should also mention another person who is getting going by the turn of the century, Rainer Maria Rilke, the great poet, the letter writer, the novelist. You might think of his, notebooks of, Malte Lorenz Brigge, which influenced Jean-Paul Sartre, Nausea, right, and his wonderful poetry. And we can't speak of Rilke or Nietzsche without bringing in another important figure who arguably can be said to be an existentialist, Lou Andreas Salome, one of the first female psychoanalysts, somebody who is connected with Nietzsche and also with Rilke, who actually writes a whole study on Nietzsche. So she's an important figure as well. Then we can start talking about other key thinkers, Martin Buber, the great Jewish thinker that I think most people identify with his work, I and Thou. He's around at the time. We have, of course, Franz Kafka, who, leaves behind not only a bunch of really interesting stories and letters, but also a few parables, semi-essays, you might say, that will be so inspiring to other existentialist figures. And then we get some philosophers at the time as well. So in Germany, we've got two people who are going to become massively important for our understanding of existentialism and for identifying Existenzphilosophie. And that is Karl Jaspers, who is also a physician and psychologist, and the professor's professor, Martin Heidegger, as well. But we have another person, and the first person in France to start using this term existentialism, Gabriel Marcel. Massively important, not only in the phenomenological movement, but in early existentialism. He's one of these people who, by the way, when Sartre takes over the term existentialism, Marcel will stop calling himself an existentialist and instead call himself a Christian Socratic. But he's doing existentialist philosophy. We can also say that there's a couple other figures that we might want to include within this second wave. In America, in part because of his analysis of double consciousness, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, important figure teaching at Harvard, going to influence other black existentialists down the line in America. We also have another literary figure who people do identify as existentialist sometimes, and that would be T.S. Eliot, the great poet. And we have another French author who is, mostly known for novels, and that would be André Gide. However it's translated, La Nourriture Terrestre would be existentialist. Some of his other works would figure in with that as well. So all of these are people that you could say are within a second wave of existentialism that is taking off, gaining momentum, forming networks from about 1900 onward. There's one other figure that I think we could include who is a playwright, and I'd say is arguably existentialist, though usually they call him just modernist, and that would be August Strindberg up in Sweden. So now you see that it's no longer just a Central European and Russian matter. It's still Russian, it's still Central European, it's also happening in Spain, a little bit in France. Some English-speaking authors as well could figure into that. Some might include Hemingway as an existentialist, in particular because his story, A Clean, Well-Lit Place, is often incorporated into anthologies on existentialism. So we've got quite a wide range of people at this point. Let's talk now about the existentialism that became, let's say, much more famous, successful, popular, and became sort of the face of existentialism within pop culture. If you watch Monty Python, they're not usually referencing, August Strindberg or, Fyodor Dostoevsky. They're going to talk about Jean-Paul Sartre and his ilk, right? So we can talk about a third wave of existentialism. And let's say that the roots of this are prior to World War II, but it really takes off after World War II. And it's got a distinctively Frenchy flavor to it. You know, the French are reading these other earlier people, but they're becoming the face of the movement. So I've mentioned Jean-Paul Sartre, philosopher, novelist, playwright, essayist. He's massively important and influential, as is his partner for life, Simone de Beauvoir, who also writes a few plays, memoirs, travel accounts, novels, and some really great philosophy on her own part. There was another figure who was associated with them that in the past often was called an existentialist. It's a little bit questionable how well he fits in there, and that would be Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Nowadays, I think we typically view him more as a phenomenologist, less as an existentialist, but I'm cool with him being included. We've already mentioned some of the other people that they're engaging with, these Russians like Berjayev, we've got Marcel. All of these people are in Paris engaging with each other. But then we also have Albert Camus, massively important, influential figure, part of that gang until he and Sartre and de Beauvoir split. Doesn't call himself an existentialist. Doesn't actually call himself an absurdist either. That's more other people, but he talks about philosophy of the absurd, which changes over time. You know, the big difference between the myth of Sisyphus to the rebel. In one, the pressing problem is that of suicide. In the other, it's murder. And we've got all sorts of great works in between that you can read as well, like Letters to a German Friend. Somebody else who I think is well worth checking out and reading, Frantz Fanon, who is from the Caribbean, studies in France, not only studies philosophy, but also is a psychiatrist, engages in a lot of application of existentialism and psychotherapy and psychoanalysis within contexts of colonial struggle and making sense out of that. We could also talk about Emil Cioran in Romania, rather pessimistic figure, definitely within the existentialist spectrum. We can talk about, over in Japan, Keiji Nishitani, who studied with Heidegger, major figure in the Kyoto School, thinking out the meaning of existentialism and nihilism in post-war Japan. We've got other important figures we could talk about in America, particularly with Black existentialism. Richard Wright, who's actually in Paris a lot of the time. We also have Ralph Ellison. The Invisible Man is often viewed as an existentialist work. And we have other, writers as well who we can classify as being with that penumbra. Two French authors in particular, Jean Anouilh, the playwright, probably best known for his adaptation of Antigone, but he wrote many other plays as well. And then Marguerite Duras, probably best known for Hiroshima Mon Amour, but again, somebody who wrote quite a bit of her own stuff. And then we have Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot, existentialist, absurdist piece. He figures into that. And you notice that the center of gravity, it's not as if all existentialism is being done in Paris, but Paris is pretty important for this third phase of existentialism, which is going to be the more successful one, which will go out and permeate pop culture for a long time and is, sort of the thing that people have in mind when they think of existentialist philosophy. There's one other person who I'll mention from that era as well that you may be familiar with. He was somebody who survived the Nazi camps. He was a psychotherapist, came out and wrote one very popular book, Man's Search for Meaning, and then a lot of really much more rigorous and interesting, less often read works of philosophy and psychology, and that would be Viktor Frankl. So we have a number of different authors. We see that existentialism ceases to be, in the third phase, a primarily just European development. We see existentialists in Japan of sorts, in Africa, the Caribbean, America, and it's going to spread from there. We will see, by the way, down the line, existentialists in places where French culture has gone, like Vietnam, although the communist takeover kind of put an end to that. And we see existentialism become, at least in some philosophy departments, an integral part of the course of studies, and it's still being taught today. I routinely teach a class on existentialist philosophy and literature. It's always fully enrolled because people want to study this interesting branch or movement, you could call it, of 19th and 20th century philosophy with, I would say, a lot of contemporary implications. It's a living philosophy, and we can go back to the early figures, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky. We can look at these second wave thinkers like Rilke or Kafka, Heidegger, Marcel, pick whoever we like. Or we can jump right into the more trendy Sartre, Camus, de Beauvoir, or the post-colonial stuff as well, with Fanon. And we get a lot of really rich texts, approaches, insights, experiences, observations. We could talk about living in a fourth phase of existentialism where people pick it up and run with it and do things with it, whether they be philosophers applying it to love like, Sky Cleary, or filmmakers taking up key existentialist themes and running with them, novelists, pick whoever you like. But that, I think, should give you a decent overview, at least for the moment, not of everybody who's ever been involved with or called an existentialist, right? But of at least some of the figures that are worth thinking about, reading, engaging with. And if you do that, you will likely find others who are tangentially connected with them, where we could debate about whether they should be called existentialists. Maria Zambrano in Spain, for example, who's more of a phenomenologist, but has a lot of connections with these sorts of people. Or, we could pick all sorts of others as well and say, maybe they're existentialists, maybe they're not. But there is kind of a core of thinkers, of texts that you can go to. And I'll put all of these into the video description just in case you missed them. So we'll do more of these videos. You won't have to wait another 10 years to get another video in this sequence or series. Probably, a month or two down the line. But that is at least my take as somebody who's been interested in studying and then later on teaching existentialist philosophy and literature for a long, long time.